Hello, today we're making a Ringwraith, so stick around. It's time to settle the age-old question. Which Ringwraith is cooler? Is it the ones from the Peter Jackson 2001 film adaptation, or is it perhaps the Ringwraith from the classic Ralph Bakshi's 1978 movie? It's a movie no one's ever heard of. No, of course I'm not gonna pin those two immortal classics against each other. But if I'm able to keep your attention for a couple of more minutes, then perhaps I might be able to convince you to watch the 1978 movie. Cause even though watching 45-year-old cartoons isn't your thing necessarily, I still recommend that you watch it, if you have the time. Once the first initial layer of clay had been added to the sculpture, then it was time to start adding some details. This time I started with the shoes. It's not something that I do with every sculpture, but it kind of feels right to work my way up from the bottom. The Ringwraiths from the 1978 movie had quite a ragtaggedy feel to them. They had a lot of pieces of fabric flopping around here and there. I don't know why, and the shoes, or should I say boots, were no exception to that. Then the legs were done, and it was time to move upwards. Sculpting hands is one of those necessary evils that you have to do sometimes. It's one of those things you wish you could outsource to an underpaid employee, working from an undisclosed underground facility somewhere remote, but sometimes you have to do it yourself. The hard way. More ragtaggedy pieces of fabric were crafted, and this time it was the part of the clothing that would cover up the hips. Then I made a belt to hold the Nazgul's pants in place. It would be quite unfortunate if the pants would suddenly drop to the ground, as you were trying to stab Frodo. I added a flat circle of clay, followed by an equally but longer piece. Then I blended them together as they would become the main part of the cloak. The cloak was looking too flat, so I put my opposable thumbs to work and I squeezed some folds into existence. As previously mentioned, the 1978 Ringwraiths have a lot of ragtaggedy pieces of fabric flopping around, so I put one piece on each side of the chest and one longer piece in between the back and the cloak.
The ring, Frodo! Take off the ring!
Anything for you, Aragorn. The one ring was rolled out into some really thin clay snakes, as it was time to sculpt one of the more interesting design choices of the Witch King. I'm no fashion designer, but wearing what looks like the sad remains of a basketball net dangling from your chest is quite a statement. However, I hadn't thought about how I was gonna go about attaching it to the sculpture, and well... But no harm, no foul. After a couple of tears and white-knuckled table punches, the ropes were safely secured to the Ringwraith. Before starting on the head, I added a collar on top of the shoulders that the face eventually would poke out of, looking like a little gopher. The collar also got blinged out with a necklace of some sort, made by one flat circle and two flat octagons that I gave some additional details. And in between those, I put some really tiny rings of clay to tie it all together. Then it was time to make the face, or should I say the helmet, because there isn't too much face to talk about. But compared to Peter Jackson's Ringwraiths, these ones actually have individual helmets that give them a bit more personality, in my opinion. The details on the helmet actually look a bit different throughout the movie, due to the fact that the movie was rotoscoped and some scenes were purely animated, while others were live action. But I modeled mine after the sequence taking place on Weathertop, where the Witch King tries to stab Frodo to death. Sculpting swords is one of those things that wakes me up in the middle of the night. I never really know how to go about it, and that stresses me out. And knowing that I would have to sculpt two swords for the Witch King really spiked my anxiety as I spiraled out into a cold, sweaty fever dream. Anyways, the basic idea was to make the swords as flat and thin as possible before worrying too much about the shape of the blades. So I put my head down and I kept on rolling. When the sculpture had been in the oven for 30 minutes, then I proceeded to sand the swords down. That way I would be able to smooth out the roughest parts, because even though I tried my best, the sword still left some things to be desired. But hey, that's okay. Then we were done with the sculpting and it was time to make a base. I didn't want to make an over-the-top looking base, but just something simple. So I traced a circle using the round cork thing on a suitable piece of XPS foam. And in the heat of the moment, I decided that I wanted the base to be octagonal, so I just cut away all the four corners. Then I took my trusty old rock that I found somewhere, and I started to poke on the side to make the sides a bit more texturous. I drew a couple of squiggly lines on the top of the base that I later on would poke away with my knife to make it look like stone tiles. Lastly, I removed the knife blade from the knife handle and used it to smooth out the edges between the tiles a bit. When that was done, then the base was done, and it was time to paint. I started by painting the Ringwraith with a black base coat from top to bottom. And of course, whenever there are any thin and fragile parts on my sculpture, I never miss the opportunity to break them off when painting. But there's nothing that superglue can't fix. Next it was time to go full on Jackson Pollock for a while. The idea for the paint job was to use a very limited palette of colors and do the most with the ones that I had. Instead of thinking color, I was thinking texture and how light reacts to different materials. So I stippled on about 1 million tiny dots to the cloak to get a really nice worn look to it. But of course, I was still thinking in terms of highlights and shadows and not just going full on randomness with my painting. The seemingly unpractical yet fashionable ropes got painted to make them look a bit more ropey, but they ended up looking a bit more like vines, I guess. I have never been amazing at painting with a technique known as NMM, and what NMM basically means is that you paint in a way that emulates the way metals reflect light from a certain angle. But this time it turned out okay. I'm not entirely sure what kind of material I was aiming at replicating with the body armor, so I basically just painted a bright to dark gradient on each of the individual squares and just call it good. In a similar fashion to the other metallic parts, I tried my best to make the helmet look shiny. Since metals reflect way more light than fabric, I made sure to only paint the brightest highlights on the parts that I wanted to read as metal. Nothing screams Ringwraith more than a pair of evil red eyes, I guess. Perhaps. I decided to paint the swords with a metallic silver paint instead of painting it with a non-metallic metal technique I previously used. Because one of my mottos in life is to not overcomplicate things, and painting NMM on a semi-poorly sculpted sword is a pain in the ass. And we're done! Amazing!
Fashion. Style.
Then it was time to paint the base. Once the black base coat had dried, then it was time to paint the base a bit more green. Some darker grey were added to the base, followed by a lime green that were painted all along the edges of the tiles on the base. And then, lastly to finish up the base, I dry brushed the sides with a light grey to make them look a bit more rocky. And then the only thing that was left to do was to glue down the Ringwraith to the base. I'm gonna show you the final results in just 1 second, but before that I just want to take the time and say thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you. If you like this video and you feel like you want to help this channel grow, please consider giving this video a thumbs up or perhaps subscribe if you don't want to miss any other video that I release. Thank you so much. Goodbye!